Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Survival Guide. My name is Mage and today we're discussing the Yeti. I've spent the past few weeks categorizing many creatures, monsters, and the sword on how to adventure best to fight them. And for this week I'm discussing the Yeti, how would an adventurer fight it, find it, and defeat it. This is a very interesting discussion because the Yeti has a lot of similarities with a few fantasy creatures, mostly being large. Well, the biggest example is Bigfoot or the Sasquatches, but for this video I really focused in on a lot of the colder climates and the creatures found there. And for most of this study, it's either in Canada or in the Himalayas. A large variety of my sources have come from various things such as British explorers, Himalayan folktales, and the such. I actually found quite a lot from around the 18th century of various British explorers, such as Captain Abercrombie that I'll mention later. For the most part, the surrounding townships and villages nearby Lady Yeti's lair describe various traits and behaviors of the creature. The Yeti is described as being anywhere from being 9 to 12 feet tall, though later in the line there was particularly one that was said to be quite small, being about 4 feet tall. All of them are covered in fur, this being a sort of gray or white fur that is able to camouflage quite well in the snow and climate of the mountains and regions. For the most part, Yetis would of course live in mountainous and snow-covered regions, anything from the Himalayas to the North American wilderness. Further describing the Yeti, a very interesting detail I found is one of the sources mentions that the Yeti has metal fingernails. This is actually akin to a few other creatures, such as ogres and such. This also kind of falls into some sort of thing I'm not entirely sure about. Very often during my research, I find some details or some parts that I'm not really sure if it's a literary device or is to be taken as fact with the creature. A good example of this is the Yeti is being said to have backwards feet in quite a few of my sources. This is actually kind of common amongst certain mythologies or legends, anything from an Irish giant, dwarves, ghosts, and even Indian wildmen. With the heels being to the front, this actually makes tracking a Yeti quite difficult, as you'd be basically pointed in the wrong direction. If you're hunting the Yeti, you'd be going away from it, and if you're trying to get away from the Yeti, you'll be putting straight into its own path. A good way to check is if this is happening is to check if the heel is deeper than the forefront of the foot. Having the heel being deeper into the ground usually means the heel is pointed towards the direction of travel, and thus you should follow that way. Another detail about this very pertains to the female Yeti, and this is actually important to discussion. It's said in various sources and such that the female Yeti has very large breasts, hanging low, and when they run, they have to sling them over their shoulders to be able to move quickly. The reason this is pertinent to the discussion is it says again and again that the female Yeti is slowed down by these breasts. And so if you're hunting a female Yeti, this actually lets you know that they're a bit slower than the male counterparts. This actually shows up in a few stories. One of the best examples is when a female Yeti known as a Nyalmo kidnaps a frog hunter and forces him to live on a cliff. Both sexes of the Yeti are said in various stories to kidnap the opposite gender of humans for a mate, preying on lone villagers or wayfarer travelers. They would capture them and then take them away to their lair. In reference to this frog hunter, they lived together for about 2 years, having a son and a daughter. The man was very much not happy with this, and one day when he was repairing a shoe, the Yeti asked him about it, after which he promptly made her a shoe and sewed it directly into her foot. After this period, he then found some salt, and giving it to Yeti, who did find it quite delicious, tricked her into letting the four of them go to his village to go get more. They set off, the man carrying the son and the Yeti the daughter. They moved along quite fast until the man began outpacing the Yeti, and because, paraphrasing this, her breast was so huge she lagged behind. In response to this, the Yeti paused on a large rock to call for him to slow down, at which point the daughter fell to the ground, cracking her skull open on the rock. In a very animalistic way, the story describes the Yeti consuming her dead daughter's brains and proceeding to chase after the man who makes it to the village, at which point the entire village rallies together and pushes away the furious Yeti. This story tells us quite a few interesting details about the Yeti. For the most part, about them hunting and capturing humans to use as mates. This is probably what actually allowed for quite a few quests for an adventurer, whether you would be to a township and being hired by someone to rescue their family member or someone they care about that's been captured by a Yeti. Or possibly the adventuring party or the lone adventurer would be out in the wild and being attacked by a Yeti trying to get captured. Either way, it kind of puts the adventurer and the Yeti at odds, whether being hunted or being the hunter. It's intelligent enough to do basic communication, as well as understand a few things about basic human culture and items, such as the man using his shoes and being curious enough about it. The other interesting attribute that actually might help an adventurer is it being tricked by the salt in food. There's actually quite a few stories across various sources of cultures or villages doing this to a Yeti. There's various stories and such of how villagers, townspeople, and such would leave out alcohol, beer, meat, or various spirits to go and trick the Yeti into drinking it. They would leave them in barrels, kegs, or even holes in rocks, waiting until the Yeti consumed it, and either becoming so inebriated it was an easy fight, or just passing out. At which point they would either tie it up or just straight up slaughter it. The Yeti is very often counterparted by stories of wild men and various other creatures that are these wild animalistic sort of things. And they show this aspect occasionally in various stories by hunting and preying on certain individuals. A very good example of this is told by Captain W.R. Abercrombie of the 2nd U.S. Infantry during the Klondike Gold Rush. This was a period between 1898 and 1899, where he was told about a glacier demon from a score of downtrodden prospectors living in rough, overcrowded, and downright nasty environments. In his words, a big, raw-boned Swede told him that he and his son were traveling from a location known as 12 Mile Plant along the way to the coast. Halfway through a glacier, the son was attacked by a supposed Yeti, grasping his throat, trying to strangle him. The son, being quite strong, managed to shove the creature and drive it away. Later down the line of the same trip, the weather worsened and the Yeti attacked again. Although the father and son strained to drive it and push it away, managed to grasp and strangle the son. Abercrombie heard various tales of the creature from other prospectors, being described as a small but heavy-built man. In his article, he theorized that this was due to mental derangement, as well as the harsh conditions and scurvy that the prospectors were suffering from. This particular Yeti was incredibly animalistic, hunting down the father and son and tearing them apart. Not even a word about speaking or doing anything remotely intelligent besides just trying to kill them. It was, however, intelligent enough to track them down and strike when an opportune moment happened, such as when the weather worsened and visibility during the snowstorm was very low. Going back to the Himalayan Yeti, it was actually referenced to be a bad omen by various sources. For those it encountered, it would give sickness or eventual death to those it accosted. Occasionally, it would also contest a strong man in a fight, and whoever won would not be brought to illness. This is actually very dangerous to adventurers. If this happens just by looking or encountering a Yeti, just being sick afterwards makes it very dangerous, especially if you have to travel against a very harsh wilderness to get back to civilization or safety. Apparently, the father of the Sherpa who led the first successful trip of Everest was also detailed to come to a sickness after he witnessed a Yeti. Now, all this put together, how would you actually beat a Yeti? And how would you even encounter it in the first place? Like I said before, the Yeti likes to hunt and either capture or kill individuals. This is probably the most likely way you encounter a Yeti, whether you being on a quest from a townsperson, being hired to save their family, or you're the one being attacked by a Yeti and being tried to either killed or captured by the Yeti. Like I said, the Yeti lives in caves and cliffs high on mountains. This is incredibly dangerous, as just getting the Yeti requires a multi-day trek up through harsh wilderness, being cold, and you possibly to die just from the environment alone. And even when you get to the Yeti, it is incredibly strong, being able to probably lift boulders or logs, and if it's also intelligent enough, it could probably also lay traps or lay in wait using its fur as camouflage. Now, whenever you find the cave or cliff the Yeti has its lair in, what kind of a weapon would you use? I don't like this particular section because it is up to the adventurer, and it's such a broad topic of which weapon to use. For the Yeti specifically, I will probably say that lighter weapons, such as a rapier or any other sort of thing, probably isn't the best. As to first fight the Yeti, you have to actually get there first. So having smaller weapons, or weapons you can travel, like sidearms and such, to get through the harsh wilderness would probably be best. The Yeti also probably has a thick hide, so smaller weapons may have trouble getting through. Of course, like always, the bow would probably be king, if you also had a war bow that could probably punch through a Yeti at a safe distance for the adventurer. There were a few sources I mentioned on various town people actually fighting or killing Yetis. For the most part, they actually had some clever ideas. This actually kind of spreads to a few other things, such as wildmen and the sort, where townships and villages would leave out alcohol or beer kegs or anything of the sort that the Yeti would come and then drink. And this would probably work very well for an adventurer, either leaving out bottles or like any way for a Yeti to easily acquire it, And finding this as a good source of food, it will drink it, either becoming inebriated, so you can have an easier fight, or you can also poison the alcohol, and so it can just straight up die. Carrying a large barrel of mead or alcohol is probably incredibly dangerous and just not feasible for a whole lot of adventurers. It could possibly freeze, break open, or do so many things on the way up to the mountain. So a better option may be doing some raw meat. You could do some local hunting around the area, either hunting venison or other large creatures like elk, and either poisoning or toxining the meat to either outright kill or to weaken the Yeti. This method is also really good for avoiding personal confrontation with the Yeti. This would allow you to avoid the illness or sickness that the Yeti brings to those who encounters it, as well as avoiding any possible way it could overpower you or set a trap of its own. That's pretty much all I could really wanted to say about the Yeti. It's a very interesting creature and is quite like a lot of other fantasy creatures, and so for this one I had to sort of really nail my search for this particular creature. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching this video, and God bless you adventurers.